Watergate, one of the most infamous scandals of the 20th century, dealing with 37th US President Richard Nixon. Now, what is Watergate? I am so glad you didn't ask because I know too much about this topic. First, we have to go a little back to the Pentagon Papers. The Pentagon Papers, in short, was a top-secret document detailing the United States' overall political and military involvement. They had revealed that the U.S. secretly enlarged the scope of its actions in the Vietnam War with coastal raids and Marine Corps attacks, none of which were reported in the mainstream media. Now, a man by the name of Daniel Ellsberg, a psychiatrist, had released the papers to multiple newspapers. Nixon, of course, absolutely hated this, and had established something called the Plumbers Unit to fix leaks in the White House. Kind of on the nose. Led by G. Gordon Liddy, the unit raided Ellsberg's office, hoping to find information on him to potentially use as blackmail. Now, Watergate itself was the name of the hotel where the beginnings of the real scandal happened. Liddy, who was transferred to the Committee to Re-elect the President, or CREEP, was the one with the initial idea. The plan was to break into the Democratic Party's headquarters and wiretap it to monitor their, telephone conversations, which had the approval of Attorney General John Mitchell. There is still no clear answer as to why they were doing this in the first place, or if Nixon explicitly authorized this, but what we do know is that it was a way of ensuring a win for the president in the election of 1972. The 5 included in the break-in were arrested that night. Later that year, Nixon did in fact carry the election in all of the states except for Massachusetts and the District of Columbia. Former Nixon aide and FBI agent G. Gordon Liddy and James McCord, an ex-CIA agent and former security director of the Committee to Re-elect the President, are convicted in their roles of the break-in at the Watergate complex. They are found guilty of conspiracy, bugging DNC headquarters, and burglary. 2 months later or so, Nixon talks with White House counsel John Dean, who is still alive today, about a certain cancer in the presidency and how to pay Watergate braggers to continue the cover-up.
I think that there's no doubt about the seriousness of the problem we've got. We have a cancer close to the presidency that's growing. It's growing daily. It's compounding. It grows geometrically now because it compounds itself. That'll be clear as I explain, some of the details of why it is. And it basically is because, one, we're being blackmailed. Two, people are going to start perjuring themselves very quickly that have not had to perjure themselves to protect other people and the like. And that is and there's no assurance. But there's no denying the fact that the White House and Ehrlichman, Hallam, and Dean are involved in some of the early money decisions. I would say these people are going to cost $1 million over the next few years.
You want the money, you need the money. You get the money.
Well, I think that's where...
What I mean is, you can get $1 million, but you can get it in cash. I know where it can be done. It's not easy, but it can be done. But the question is, who the hell would handle it?
That's right.
The idea of
well, I would think that would be something that Mitchell ought to be charged with.
Now, here's where things get really, really messy. So, Watergate burglar James McCord's letter confessing the existence of a wider conspiracy is read out in an open court by Judge Cicera? Never know how to say that dude's name. Along with this, John Dean starts to cooperate with the prosecutors. Many resignations follow this, including Acting FBI Director L. Patrick Gray, White House aides John don't know how to say his name either, I'll just put it up. And H.R. Haldeman, John Dean, is also fired. Alexander Butterfield, former presidential appointments secretary, meets with the Senate investigators, where he reveals the existence of an extensive secret taping system in the White House.
Well, there was no doubt in my mind that they were installed to record things for posterity, for the Nixon library. The president was very conscious of that kind of thing. We had quite an elaborate setup at the White House for the collection and preservation of documents and of things which transpired in the way of business of state.
On whose authority were they installed, Mr. Butterfield?
On the president's authority by way of Mr. Haldeman and Mr. Higbee.
The president instruct Mr. Haldeman, and Mr. Haldeman instruct Mr. Higbee, who in turn instructed you?
Mr. Haldeman instructed Mr. Higbee to tell me, and as I said earlier, I was the liaison with the Secret Service. It would be proper for me to give the instruction to the Secret Service.
During your tenure at the White House, as far as your own knowledge is concerned, who else knew about the presence of these recording devices?
The President, Mr. Haldeman, Mr. Higbee, and I. Plus the Secret Service people who I would prefer not to name in this public hearing, and that this kind of thing is a part of their profession.
5 days later, Nixon reportedly orders the White House taping system disconnected. A little bit suspicious. President Nixon refuses to turn over the recordings of the White House conversations to Senate investigation and to Cox. The tapes are believed to include the evidence that Nixon and his aides had attempted to cover up their involvement in the Watergate break-in and other illegal activities, which, in my opinion, is extremely idiotic. Like, imagine just being, hey, Mr. President, can you give us these tapes that confirm that you're, like, not doing anything illegal? No. Like, huh? Nixon attempts a legal maneuver to avoid handing over the tapes to Cox by suggesting that U.S. Senator John Stennis to summarize the tapes for investigators. Cox will refuse the offer the next day. He will soon be fired. On November 17th of 1973, a televised press conference in Florida is made where one of Nixon's most famous quotes come from.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president is a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes, sir.
In April, transcripts of more than 1,200 pages of edited transcripts of the Nixon tapes are released by the White House. Of course, this was not necessarily enough for the Senate, and the House Judiciary Committee starts the impeachment proceedings against Nixon. The Supreme Court rules that Nixon must surrender dozens of original tape recordings of conversation. Finally, on August 8th of 1974, President Nixon finally resigns.
I have never been a quitter. To leave office before my term is completed is abhorrent to every instinct in my body. But as president, I must put the interests of America first. America needs a full-time president and a full-time Congress, particularly at this time with problems we face at home and abroad.
Now, there is so much more to this case that I could go over, but I don't think I can physically just do that in the amount of time that I have to do this. So, if you're curious, just ask me, because I know a little bit too much about this, and I literally just went over the basics.